Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your daily sit rep for Monday, the 5th of January, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. It was a busy weekend, lots happening. We are going to cover Venezuela. We're going to actually break down Venezuela, and I'm going to explain why this is so important. A lot of people are missing it, either because they are ignorant, and that's a great many people, but a lot of people have been against this Venezuela thing, and I think it's intentional. I think they're intentionally misinforming their followers, in many cases their constituents, because they have a political axe to grind, and they're not telling you the full picture. As Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. With that, we're going to go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. There's a vote coming up today, and Democrats are trying to remove some options for President Trump. By the way, I saw a lot of Democrats over the weekend say, this is an illegal war. And I was looking into the protests. And amazingly, they have these signs, no blood for oil, stay out of Venezuela, hands off Venezuela. And they're in, I don't know, probably like a few dozen cities. But I was looking at these posters and looking at pictures. And it's Democratic Socialists of America. It's the big one is Party for Socialism and Liberation, which is an actual far left revolutionary party. So it's pretty much your usual crowd involved in this. But these were pretty small demonstrations, but pretty rapid. They were out there on Sunday for several hours. All right. At any rate, with that, Robert, let's go ahead and move on. Democrats are trying to limit President Trump's options. Oh, yeah. Sorry. It's Monday. I remember what I was going to say now. Everyone's talking about this war. Stop the war. We don't want war with Venezuela. Guys, we're not at war with Venezuela. There is no war. What war are you talking about? I will say there's maybe a risk of some kind of insurgency in the future. We'll talk about this a lot more later. But for now, there's no war. Robert, please let us know.
So Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said that he expects the Senate to vote this week on a war powers resolution. And Senate Democrats are going to attempt to force a floor vote on this to block the Trump administration from any further military operations in Venezuela. I think it's likely to fail. Some Democrats have offered limited praise of this operation, and that's actually caused some consternation within the party itself. And I think this failure, I think they're likely to use it as, to target the Trump administration's legitimacy. They're going to claim that this operation was an illegal order, which is a theme they've been building on for the last roughly 6 months. And I think they're going to argue that this is Trump attempting to wrest control of war authority from Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and building the case that this is, from their perspective, probably an impeachable offense, correct?
Correct.
Okay, depending on how the midterms go. All right, let's move on. Speaking of the future election, Secret Service is ramping up their recruitment as well for 2028. Is this because there is a sense that they will be needed, like required for security for the president or for the administration officials or for who?
I didn't see where they said, why they're doing this. I think it is likely because they expect 2028 to be a very heavily contested election. And there has already been, attempts on President Trump and other government officials, but they said they're planning to hire 4,000 new employees by then. And this is going to increase the size of the Secret Service by 20%. And that includes any retirements between then and now. They're still going to see a 20% increase in the size of the agency. They're planning to add 1,500 special agents. So that's the plainclothes protective agents, 500 uniformed division officers, and more than 2,000 support staff.
That's pretty huge. I know some of this stuff is more or less classified or law enforcement sensitive or whatever the Secret Service calls it. Did they release any details as to what exactly these additional support staff will be doing or who they are? Is this, I imagine some of this is going to be intelligence or like law enforcement intelligence. Are these admin roles or are these like feeding the teeth, so to speak?
Well, I think there's a mix of admin roles, probably surveillance and counter surveillance, because the FBI, for example, uses non-credentialed employees for their own surveillance and counter surveillance operations. So I imagine it covers the entire suite of everything that's not physical security.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on. By the way, this is another indicator to me, at least, that 2028 may be off the rails. All right, let's move on because the vice president's home, this is what his private residence in Cincinnati, Ohio, was
Correct. And
vandalized.
correct. And that was early this morning. A Secret Service agent witnessed a 26-year-old man from Ohio, William DeFore, enter the property and vandalize some windows and vehicles. And then they detained him with the help of the Cincinnati police. He was apparently earlier convicted in April of 2025 for vandalizing a local business and sentenced to 2 years in a mental health facility. So I'm not sure why he was not actually serving that sentence, more than 6 months later. And I think this is one of the additional threats to the stability in the United States, and especially targeting government officials. This is a lot of the messaging around the non-legitimacy of the Trump administration and the attempts by Trump and JD Vance to be, quote unquote tyrants. This messaging, I think, is also appeals to people who aren't necessarily politically activated but might be mentally ill, who will, and I think in this case, likely target some of these officials just because they're being bombarded with a lot of this messaging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, we're going to touch on this a little bit later in the global sit rep, but Robert, it looks like a Chinese company tried to purchase an American semiconductor manufacturer, correct?
So this company is technically incorporated in Delaware. It's called HIFO Corporation, but CFIUS said there's evidence that the person actually running the company is a Chinese national, and they attempted to purchase another company called MCOR Corporation out of New Jersey, which does have advanced semiconductor technology. The Trump administration blocked this purchase last week and over the weekend, and they ordered this company, HIFO Corporation, to divest all of these assets. They did say in this executive order that's been issued, the Attorney General does have the authority to take any steps necessary to enforce this order. So that means possibly criminal prosecution.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, another big thing for 26 and 28, the U.S. Postal Service is changing a regulation where they're going to start stamping letters, which could include potentially mail-in ballots, on the day that the piece of mail was processed, not the day that it was received at the front of the post office, correct?
Correct.
So this could potentially delay some mail or delay the date on, say, some mail-in ballots by a day, 2-3 days more.
Correct. And this is one of the USPS said officially this is not a change in regulation, but one of the union leaders, the Postal Service union leader, said this actually is a change from the current practice. And looking into it, right now, 14 states have a mail-in ballot grace period. So that means when you send a mail-in ballot in and it's postmarked the day of the election or the election day, then it can be counted up to anywhere between like 3 to 5 days after the election. I think importantly, this includes some key Democrat-controlled states: California, New York, Washington, Oregon, and Virginia. I think Democrats are going to cite this policy change as a claim that the Trump administration is going to attempt to cheat in the 2026 and 2028 elections by invalidating these mail-in ballots.
Mm-hmm. It sure seems that Democrats are building the case. If they do not take back the House, and by the way, I think for the past something like 16 election cycles, 90% of those have gone to, in 90% of election cycles, in the midterms, the incumbent party loses the House. So there's baseline, roughly 90% chance in general. And so it seems like Democrats are going to cry foul if they somehow do not take back the House. Ken Martin, isn't that his name? Ken Martin, he's the head of the Democratic National Committee. He said, and he said this repeatedly, but most recently, a week or two ago, he said, President Trump's plan is to flood these blue cities with, not just with federal law enforcement, but with the military to depress voter turnout. He said he wants, Ken Martin said, Trump wants the troops on these streets through the midterm elections in order to suppress voter turnout. So it seems like they are already building this case that if Democrats do not win the midterms, it's because they were stolen, which is a very dangerous claim, obviously. Robert, is that what you're seeing?
Correct. Yeah. And I think that the Trump administration is making moves to try to prevent losing the House, and that are likely to be effective. Like one of the big ones is they're ramping up President Trump's presence around the midterms in order to deliberately draw out, the low and mid propensity voters. So I think they're trying to set the conditions, and I think they are likely to succeed in setting the best possible conditions for the Republicans to hold on to the House. Of course, the base case, like you said, is that the House flips, and if it doesn't, this is going to be a major point of pressure, public pressure on the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. By the way, just on that point, Polymarket had last week on Friday had something like 78 or 79% chance the House will flip to the Democrats. So it is at least this early trending their way. We'll see what it looks like over the summer once we start getting Q1, Q2 GDP numbers back. I think maybe some things will change. All right. And then let's move on here to another federal court says illegal aliens do not have Second Amendment protections.
And this is coming out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. What's interesting about this decision is not just that they, according to this decision, 8 other circuits have said that there is no Second Amendment protection for illegal aliens. In the decision, they specifically said that illegal aliens lack any allegiance to the U.S. and are not part of the sovereign body politic. I think that this is going to be language that is adopted by the Trump administration going forward. It might even be possible that I think some of them on the Ninth Circuit, some of these judges on this panel were conservative. Maybe this is done purposefully for the administration to be able to use language like this, specifically that illegal aliens do not count as, quote, the people or the nation's political community, especially as we see more of these court fights move forward with the Trump administration on like birthright citizenship, which we're still waiting on the ruling from the Supreme Court, and some of these other immigration cases as these immigration operations ramp up.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of compromise, I'm waiting for Democrats, if they do get back into power, and we do see this Project 2029, to come out and just say, you know what, illegal aliens should be able to vote, but they'll just count for 3/5 of a vote. We'll call that maybe we'll call it the Great Compromise. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to lots of news over in the global sit rep, starting with, take a guess, Venezuela. Yes. All right, Jared. So Delta Force, some U.S. other military special operations components, and with the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, rolled into Caracas. They blew up some radar facilities, I guess, maybe. Cyber attacked the rest. Apparently, they were Chinese made, maybe Chinese and Russian made. They did not function. Apparently, the Venezuelans did not even see this operation coming until they heard it before they saw it, heard the choppers come through. And then and the choppers were flying very low also to be off of radar. Something like over 100 aircraft also used in this. I mean, I imagine heavily SIGINT and electronic warfare, basically trying to shut down the communications so the Venezuelan security services could not talk to each other. And then also, this was reported in Mexican news. I don't know if it made it over here, I mean, if it made it to English news or not, but allegedly Maduro's entire security team, and I'm just telling you what Mexican news was reporting, Maduro's entire security team at his compound, which I believe was on a military base, they're all Cuban. Like, the guy didn't even trust Venezuelans to protect him. He had to get the ideologically convinced Cuban security, which were Soviet and Russian trained. Pretty good, probably. At any rate, they were all killed, or I think maybe mostly killed. And then Maduro was, I guess, pulled out of bed, put on a bird, and then flown out. All right, so that's kind of the big picture here, Jared.
Yes.
Please,
real quick on the Cuban part.
Yep.
Secretary of State confirmed that.
Okay, great.
So, and there were 32 Cuban deaths, and the Cubans are not happy about this. So we're going to start off with a couple of tertiary, related issues in Venezuela. The Venezuelan government in waiting, which we've been tracking for a few weeks now, or maybe a few months now, they declared on Saturday that Edmundo Gonzalez Arita must be recognized as the president and immediately assume his constitutional mandate. We'll get more into that later. That's not happening. The Venezuelan defense minister issued a statement supporting the succession of Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez to the presidency per their constitution, but also declared that Venezuela will not be administered by Washington. And that will also play into much more later. Moving over to Cuba, President Trump said last night in a press conference that, quoting, Cuba is literally ready to fall. And he said this is because Cuba gets all of its income from Venezuela. When asked if he was considering military action against Cuba, similar to what we saw in Venezuela, Trump neither confirmed nor denied, and instead said, I think it's just going to fall. So it looks like we may get a 2-for-1 here. And that's,
well, we may get a 3-for-1 because we have these protests that have been ongoing in Iran as well. And listen, the Russians have been sending emergency food and fuel to Cuba for probably years now. Cuba has had power shortages. They can't keep the lights on. There's gas shortages because they don't produce a lot of the stuff domestically. Not only because they don't have the resources, but they're communist, and so they just do not produce a lot of that stuff themselves anyway. At any rate, yeah, it seems to me like Cuba probably got most or all of its oil from Venezuela, and so you have no food, you have no fuel. It does seem like this is Cuba about to be choked out.
Absolutely. Cuba has been getting oil shipments, and what little they could keep their lights on, it was coming from Venezuela. So I don't think they're going to last very long. And this is the picture here, by the way, is a satellite photo of them at night. They can't keep the lights on. Moving over to Colombia.
Well, hang on, just 1 second. I just want to point something out here on Venezuela. I've watched a bunch of politicians' reactions and on the Sunday shows and then on social media, and there's really one of two things going on here. And I'm not saying this. I'm not talking about the legality of this. Frankly, on the topic of international law and whether this was legal or not, the post-1945 rules-based international order is over. I mean, I think people have been talking about that for a while, especially here on this show. And these politicians, including over in Europe, but pretty much everyone, has to understand that's over. It's not coming back. There's a new world order that is being built, and you're living through it right now. So I look at this Maduro raid on Venezuela, or this Maduro raid, and it does appear that the Trump administration obviously does not want another communist taking over. But what I've seen from politicians primarily is they are suffering from one of two things. Number one is that they do not understand the grand strategy. Maybe they haven't read the national security strategy. Maybe they just, because it came from the Trump administration, they've discounted it, or maybe they just don't like it. That's number one. That's maybe one reason why they oppose what's happened. Again, not on a legal basis, but just on a general realpolitik basis. And then the second thing is, I actually do think a lot of these Democrats do understand the grand strategy. I think they do understand the national security strategy. I think they understand how important this is for American strategic security in the future for like the next 10 or 20 plus years. And they are just doing everything they can, saying everything they can to undermine the success of the Trump administration. And this was obviously a success. There's obviously a risk, maybe, that if the United States installs a leader in Venezuela who is not legitimate, there is a huge risk for insurgency. And that is something the administration, obviously nobody wants to get bogged down in an Iraq that speaks Spanish. So, and by the way, that whole region has a very long history of communist insurgency, by the way, and terror groups and narco terror groups. So I think that's pretty much what's going on. You can really tell, Jared, by the reaction to what happened in Venezuela, you can tell whether they have read and understood the national security strategy. And this is something we've been talking about off and on for the past 2 weeks. And actually for years now. We were talking about the Monroe Doctrine back in 2017 when Rex Tillerson flew down here to Austin, Texas, and said the Monroe Doctrine is back. So this is obviously not new, but it is in full force now. So I want to paint this picture of why Venezuela is so strategically important. The administration says, well, this is about drugs, and we want to stop the flow of drugs into the United States. Venezuela is a major transshipment point. I've seen a lot of Democrats say, oh, there's no fentanyl coming from Venezuela, and it's just cocaine, and cocaine's not bad or not that bad. And that is a complete misread of the situation. Venezuela is a transshipment point, and you have basically state-sponsored narco trafficking. So that is one reason to take out Maduro. But it's not just about the drugs. It is also about removing a key ally, a massive, potentially massive point of leverage in the future from China in the Western Hemisphere. And you read the national security strategy, and I got it pulled up right here. By the way, we'll post this online for early warning folks here, Ford Observer. If you should read through it. Starting on page 15, it starts to cover the Western Hemisphere. But it's saying we are removing foreign powers from the Western Hemisphere. You will not have power, influence. You'll have no authority here. And so is it just about drugs? No, but it is partially about drugs. Is it also about removing Chinese influence from the Western Hemisphere? Yes, absolutely. But it's also about one other thing, the petrodollar. And this is probably by far the most important piece of this. Folks at the Treasury are overjoyed about this. We all know by now, Trump said he briefed these oil executives. Generally, I'm sure he didn't give operational details, but generally he said, let's just say you have the opportunity to go back into Venezuela and rebuild oil infrastructure. And of course, they would all jump at the chance. So at whatever level that happened on, it happened, and the oil executives, oil companies are on. President Trump over the weekend said that he is willing to sell Venezuelan oil to China. And China is by far the largest purchaser of Venezuelan oil. He said, we will sell it to China in dollars. That is so crucial. You cannot overlook that point. That is grand strategic. Anybody, any country who buys Venezuelan oil will have to do this in dollars, which means they will have to buy dollars in order to turn around and buy oil from Venezuela. That creates dollar demand. This is about lengthening the lifespan of the petrodollar. And people can talk about the $17 trillion worth of oil, and Venezuela's got all sorts of other stuff like gold. And was it 300 billion barrels of oil? Jared, what do we produce? Robert,
300 million.
No, I think it's 300 billion. It's massive. It is. Yeah, it is by far. That's by far the largest in the world. We consume here in America something like 20 million barrels a day of oil, and they've got, I want to say 300 billion. I mean, it's an obscene amount, and just double check if you would. So at any rate, not only does this provide us with another source of oil to keep oil prices low. By the way, I feel bad for the Texas oil industry. By the way, they're probably not real happy about it, but we're also denying China a potential source of oil in the future when we want to. And then let's just say Cuba in the next 6 months, whatever, I don't know. Let's say Cuba gets somewhat sorted out. We have these protests in Iran, and the Times out of the UK reported, this is allegedly, that's just what they're saying, that the Ayatollah Khomeini over there said that he will be leaving Tehran en route to Moscow if the protests basically threaten the regime. And so basically what we're seeing is the United States restricting lines of support to China. This is so important, especially on oil. You go back to Colonel John Boyd, and he gave us a lot of gems of wisdom. Hang on, Jared, 1 second. He gave us a lot of gems of wisdom. And one of those things is what he called grand strategy. And grand strategy is the process of connecting yourself to as many power centers and lines of support as possible, while simultaneously cutting off your adversaries from as many lines of support and power centers as possible. We are connecting ourselves and disconnecting China. This is the proper context to understand what's going on in Venezuela. Is the mission over? No, of course not. They got Maduro. Job well done. Pat yourself on the back. That is a first step to delegitimizing the current communist regime. As I understand it, the communist vice president has taken over. This is obviously not over, but it looks like maybe there will be a little more carrot. Obviously, maybe a lot more stick. We'll see. But this is the process of grand strategy, connecting yourself to as many power centers as possible and disconnecting your opponent from as many power centers as possible. This is exactly what the Trump administration is doing. And so if Iran, whatever happens to Iran over this next 6 or 12 months, we are strategically choking off China's ability to do what they want. Jared, I'll bring you back on. So question for you. I've seen a lot of politicians say, Well, this is dangerous because now what are we going to tell China when they want to take back Taiwan? Now we don't have the moral authority to tell China not to move on Taiwan. And I don't really think China's that concerned about whether the United States has moral authority or not. They're concerned with whether the United States and its allies have the material authority to stop China. We have heard from U.S. officials that China has 2 to 3 months of logistics capability, call it oil, whatever. China cannot sustain large-scale combat operations for more than 2 to 3 months. That's what we've heard. Jared, do you think that is correct?
Yeah. I want to say when we did that dive into their strategic petroleum reserve, we came out at 3 months. Estimate, like the upper end of the estimate.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So basically, when you look at Venezuela, you look at Iran, and then you look at shutting down the Malacca Strait and the whole area down there near Indonesia, through which 80% of Chinese oil transits, we are basically choking off China's ability to sustain itself during large-scale combat operations. And so this is not just about, my point is, I'll make this point, we'll move on. It's not just about drugs. It's not just about ejecting China from the Western Hemisphere. It is also about strategically reducing China's military viability or military sustainment, which is absolutely crucial. And you'd think if you're a Democrat, you would look at all that stuff and you would say, or if you're any opponent of Trump, not just Democrats, but I've seen European officials come out, legality aside, and you say, actually on the net, this looks like a good thing for America, and on net, this looks like a really bad thing for China. And I cannot comprehend the logic of saying that this is good for China and bad for the United States, because it is obviously not. And what these people and what you at home, if you don't already understand, what leaders all across the world have to understand, the old order is gone. The new order is being built. And you read the national security strategy and you go back to this concept of Fortress North America and the United States hardening the Western Hemisphere. And it's pretty clear. It looks like to me, and this is something that Michael Every kind of also implied during our talk last year, is that we are going to dollarize the Western Hemisphere. And there's been a lot of talk about, the BRICS currency is the dollar killer, and that China's going to make gold-backed currency and do all these things and reduce the dollar and displace the dollar, and the dollar is no longer going to be the global reserve currency. That may be true. But in terms of dollar demand, the dollar-based financial system may recede globally, but it is not going to zero. It will be the money of the realm in the Western Hemisphere, which is resource rich. We're oceans away. And obviously elections in South America go back and forth, but you look at what's happened over the past couple of years, really even the last 6 months, with conservative or right-wing presidents being elected in Chile, Cast won in Chile, in Honduras, in a handful of other countries, obviously Malay in Argentina. And it's hard for me. It's really, really difficult for me not to be optimistic about the future of the Western Hemisphere. Jared, anything to add before we move on?
Just that I'm in complete agreement here. Yes, I'm extremely optimistic about this. I was optimistic after the national security strategy, and after seeing what that looks like in practice, no black pilling here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no black pills. And it's easy to do online, but you have to have the proper perspective. And this is not going to be perfect. Definitely is not going to be easy from here, but we're not going to zero.
No.
All right, with that, let's go ahead and move on to Colombia. I have seen calls for the United States to do to Colombia what we did to do to Gustavo Petro in Colombia, what we just did to Maduro. And I don't think that's going to happen. President Trump kind of intimated or threatened that it could. Remember, Colombia they at least have presidential elections coming up in May. And if Chile and Honduras are any indication, Colombia is really a conservative country. We could see Colombia swing back towards the right and have another opportunity to eject the communists there. At any rate, what's the latest from Petro, Jared?
So Petro decided to taunt Secretary Marco Rubio, saying that he should attempt to arrest him they should attempt to carry out a similar operation against Gustavo Petro. He also made a very personal jab against Secretary Rubio, referencing Cuban persecution. And just a reminder, aside from the previous warnings Trump has given, he did say in the press conference on the Maduro issue, he said Petro had better watch his ass. And later on, in a different press conference, he said that a similar operation in Colombia, quote, sounds good to me. Petro, do I think it's likely? No. But I also have the question of how long does the U.S. actually want to put up with this? Yes, they have 4 months from now, they will have elections. I think we will wait the 4 months, but frankly, I don't know. Additionally, over in Colombia, they moved 30,000 troops to the Venezuelan border. This is in response to the operation there. I think they're worried about instability more than they are about capturing territory, though.
Mm-hmm. This is about securing the border.
Yeah. As a reminder, the ELN, the National Liberation Army there, they out of Colombia operates states on the Venezuelan side of the border. We covered that just a few weeks ago. So they now no longer have a head to direct them. They are going to be a bit more unpredictable. Additionally, over the weekend, there were multiple U.S. military transport aircraft moved to the Middle East, and this was after Iran's Ayatollah said he would not, quote, give in to the enemy, and reports of Iran shooting protesters. And just last week, President Trump warned that the United States would come to the protesters' rescue if Iran shot protesters. Now, the Times also reported that the Ayatollah would fly to Moscow with his family if the protests worsened and threatened the regime, as you covered earlier. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, this new capability is worrying many heads of state. The Taiwanese vice defense minister said that Taiwan is already prepared to counter a Chinese version of this operation, along with a wide range of hypothetical scenarios. I do put a bit more stock in this because there have been plenty of reports of U.S. Special Forces operating in Taiwan for the last few years. They very well could actually have a defense against this through advisors.
Oh, yeah, 100,000%. Yeah, we do. They've been working on this mission for a long time. Right. Thanks for that, Jared. And not just in Taiwan, but also in parts of Europe as well. This kind of the stay behind insurgent style operations against a foreign occupation. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And we will go ahead.
Yep. So we've already covered, a large portion of the operation. There were quite a few other things that did come out of the press conference I think are very important to note. First off, no American troops or equipment were lost, despite Venezuela using, Trump words, foreign menacing offensive weapons. I think this is critically important. Venezuela uses Russian weaponry that are designed to counter American air power. That this is a failure for Russia. What that does is show that anybody depending on Russian air defenses can no longer guarantee their own security against the American state. President Trump did say he is not going to back Maria Machado's claim to governance as well. That's the government in waiting. They are already working with the vice president of Venezuela. This is why the military is in kind of an unsure position, because they said they would not back the government from Washington, but they are backing the government from Washington. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that this new capability is going to be maintained, and there is always a chance we will be tasked to do this again. They are preparing basically for this. Now, I think I want to go over two things. First, why it matters. This is the first of its kind capability, being able to extract a head of state like this and utterly defeat an air defense network at the same time while leaving no civilian casualties and taking no losses. It's incredible. Above all else, this unmatched capability grants the Trump administration a new means of deterrence abroad so that the Trump administration has time to focus on issues at home. This will make everybody this is the strategic issue that you were talking about in practice. Is the Trump administration can focus inwardly because everybody else has to worry, will this be my last day? And as far as what is next, President Trump said this extremely successful operation should serve as a warning to anyone who would threaten American sovereignty or endanger American lives. is expressing this is going to happen again if you heard us. The Trump administration is also using this to call for adversarial heads of state to stop playing games, again, their words, stop permitting or facilitating drug trafficking and begin negotiating. The officials that gave the press conference also explicitly discussed ongoing drug issues with the Colombian government. That was with the watch himself quote. And the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, went as far as to say that the government in Cuba should also be concerned after seeing this. Ultimately, I think the Trump administration has shown the world that a narco-terrorism designation from the United States carries an immediate life-ending threat, even if you are a head of state.
Yeah, we'll see. Jared, as I understand it, or at least I think it's been reported, that Venezuela was using some Chinese radar or air defense components in addition to Russian.
Yes, I have no doubt there were Chinese ones there as well. Officially, it's Russian and French, but we know that they were also getting Iranian drones. That was interdicted last week. I think this is also a major strategic loss for China, also, as far as their equipment goes, because if Chinese equipment cannot counter.
Yeah, exactly. This is where I was going with this. You're the Chinese, and now it appears that U.S. electronic warfare and cyber capabilities have shut down your air defense radars or whatever Chinese equipment was operating there. How scared are you? How concerned are you that your equipment may not work on your coast when it comes time for Taiwan or the United States or Japan or whoever to attack some Chinese sites on the coast?
Exactly. Well, there's that. And does the Trump administration wait that long? Because they've been harping on China for 10 years now about stopping fentanyl precursors. This was all under the authority of a narco-terrorism designation. The only thing really stopping the Trump administration from doing that to China is basically China is much larger than Venezuela, and there is a risk of a full-scale war there. But China meets all of these wickets. They could, and the Trump administration, I'm sure, is going to do a much deeper dive on a classified level of what equipment did fail and where that equipment is around the world. Sure. And then if they can pull this off elsewhere. If they can, I expect to see the Trump administration show China what wolf warrior diplomacy actually should look like.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, we can't rule out the future cross-border operations now. Listen, and then on this point here, I just want to, I should not get in the habit of doing this, but someone over in the comments said, Mike just told y'all we're not going back to constitutional rules-based society. So this is not a case where the United States is just going to start invading a bunch of foreign countries. It is not going to be like that. What I'm talking about is world orders. The United States has been the backstop. It has been the guarantor of a rules-based international order. And a lot of people complain that, America gets to write the rules. Well, America has been the only country capable of enforcing the rules. The Germans are going to do it. The Chinese obviously aren't. So but even that's going away. I'm not saying, when I talk about the American empire or the U.S. empire basically receding, the military receding from having a global footprint like we've had this kind of post-1945, where we've been everywhere in the world, wherever we want to be in the world, that is obviously going to end. We will continue to be in some places in the world. We just will not have this large global footprint like we've had. And instead, we are hardening the Western Hemisphere against rising revisionist powers, primarily China. So this is not a case where, when I talk about the U.S. empire or the United States basically owning the Western Hemisphere, that's what I think even some administration officials have said. It's our hemisphere. And this is true. And if you're a country, if you're like let's say you're Guyana, Essequibo, or some of these other countries that have disputes with their neighbors, or you're concerned about the guy who lives next door to you, maybe coming into your house, of course, the United States is going to be a guarantor of your security. But that means, just like it has meant on the global level, if you want America to be the backstop for the international order, you've got to use the dollar. You've got to play by our rules. And yes, there will be countries sacrificed on the altar of multipolarity in order to save the United States. I think that's probably what we're doing to Europe. And we are, I guess the bottom line on this, and we'll move on to the Homeland Ops brief, is the United States is simply going to own the Western Hemisphere. And you can say that's a good thing. You can say it's a bad thing. I think on that, it's a good thing if you're an American. And on that topic, let me just do this one other thing. Comment on this other comment. The non-active says the proper perspective is the value of the dollar doesn't matter. If I don't hear English in my local Walmart, none of this matters without deportations. All right. So the New York Times reported that and even the New York Times reported that the Trump administration has deported something like 500,000 illegals. And then I don't know actually how many, Robert, the administration claimed over 2 million illegals have self-deported, but there's some reason to doubt that number.
So the self-deportation number, I think, was 1.9 million, and they're claiming that they actively deported around 600,000. The doubt of the 1.9 million number comes from the Census Bureau. There claims that the Census Bureau counted the 1.9 million decrease in illegal aliens, basically replying to their census surveys that they conduct between the census decades.
Mm-hmm.
And the claim is that the claim is that they're just not responding, and they have not actually self-deported, and the self-deportation numbers are more like 500,000. But that is basically the hypothesis. I don't think it's actually provable that they have not self-deported.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's a fair point. So we're basically looking at, on the low end, 1 million deportations or self-deportations roughly in year one. Okay.
Correct.
So about 5% of the 20 million we'll leave it at 20 million for now, depending on how far you want to go back. We're obviously looking at a lot larger number than just 20 million. So about 5% in the first year. So I completely get this. Listen, whether 0 million are deported from here or whether the remaining 19 million are deported from here, I feel you on that, but that has nothing to do with the lifespan of the dollar. You think your life is bad with illegals in the country? Try living a life where your currency has lost world reserve status, and you think it's being inflated away now. Wait until that happens. So even if there were 0 deportations from here, this is still a monumentally important. This is a grand strategic play to expand the expand the lifespan of the dollar, and that's good for you if you're an American consumer, frankly. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on here to the Homeland Ops brief. Go ahead, Robert.
So some former Department of Homeland Security officials who are in contact with current officials said that they are expecting Phoenix, Arizona to be the next target for the Trump administration's federal immigration surges. One of these officials said that the planned construction of one of these warehouse mega detention centers in Glendale, Arizona, would allow this to basically allow the Trump administration to turn Phoenix into a removal hub. And this is one of 7 of these mega detention centers that are planned around the country. I think this does have the potential to be the largest Trump administration enforcement operation so far, though I do think the Trump administration is likely to encounter a higher level of anti-ICE resistance than other recent operations like Catalina Crunch in New Orleans and the operation in North Carolina. This is due to the presence of multiple pro-immigration organizations and rapid response groups in the Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona areas. So there is a much higher presence of progressive and far left activity here. And I think it's also important to point out that Phoenix was actually the area where the Stop Cop City movement moved to after the 61 participants were arrested on RICO charges in 2023. So this is a much more likely to be a much more active anti-ICE resistance movement in Phoenix if they do launch a federal surge here. And then during a press conference yesterday on the Venezuela incident, President Donald Trump said that the most powerful thing we have that we haven't used is the Insurrection Act, and that the administration has always considered using it to deploy troops during these federal surges. He also mentioned that they are going to redeploy military forces to support federal surges in California, Illinois, and Oregon, quote, at the appropriate time. So I think that this is likely a signal that the Trump administration is planning to ramp up. Another signal that the Trump administration is planning to ramp up operations this year, and they're just waiting for multiple pieces to fall into place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that Insurrection Act, I do not expect it before the midterms. I think Trump obviously has a lot of options before he goes to the Insurrection Act, but I'll just remind everyone, if President Trump does invoke the Insurrection Act, this is something that is very unlikely to be over in a matter of weeks. I think the backlash that he sees will probably mean that he has to expand law enforcement operations and probably expand military deployments rather than contract them. This is not something that is going to be over in 2 weeks. This is something like he invokes the Insurrection Act, and we may be living with this through the next election in November 28th, if he does wait till after the midterms, obviously. All right. Anything to add there, Robert?
No.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. All right. We do have some questions and comments. And listen, protect world reserve currency at all costs. Sounds like neocon propaganda. Guys, the dollar is going to lose world reserve currency. We will no longer be the world reserve. I'm not telling or advocating that the Trump administration should try to re-globalize the dollar. I am saying what the administration is doing is setting the conditions for the dollar to not go to zero and for the dollar to be a hemispheric reserve currency rather than a global reserve currency. I'm not here advocating that we will keep the dollar and need to take military action to keep the dollar as the world reserve. It is clearly being displaced. Over the long term, in the interim, in the near term, there's, other than gold, maybe there's just simply no competitor. No one, no currency, nothing right now can replace the dollar. All right. And Brian says, if we lose the world reserve currency status, we're cooked. Yeah, listen, if you subscribe to the John Glubb theory or the Rein Tagapera theory that empires last on average between 250 and 265 years, we'll just say in that ballpark, maybe 200-300 years, and you begin the expansion of the American empire in 1783, roughly, let's say. It's the end of the revolution. It's a Treaty of Paris. More importantly, on the North American continent, it unlocked the Trans-Appalachia movement, Trans-Appalachia region for settlement. And so if you wanted to say, I think if we're going to say the America is an empire, I would say it probably began in or about 1783. So do the math on that. 2033 is 250 years as a general rule of thumb. If you subscribe to that theory, then we have to look at really two things. What maintains the empire? Global military footprint, or at least an ability to reach out and touch someone anywhere in the world. Number one. And then number two, you have reserve currency status for the dollar. Those things are self-reinforcing. You cannot have one without the other, which is to say, if one fails, the other necessarily has to fail as well. If the dollar loses world reserve status, we will no longer be able to afford the military that we have, certainly not the global presence that we have. And at that point, we cease to be this empire. Or Pax Americana is certainly over. It's post-1945, obviously over. If we no longer have a global military footprint, then we cannot enforce the rules of Pax Americana, and that opens up alternative use of alternative currencies or alternatives to the dollar. And if that's the case, where foreign central banks are selling off dollars to buy gold, obviously dollar demand reduces, and we will eventually no longer be. And you can just look at the Tiffin paradox. Sorry, not Tiffin. Is it Triffin? Robert Triffin. Anyway, you can look at what he told Congress back in the 50s and 60s. I've talked about it many times on this show. The dollar ceases to be the world reserve. So if one goes, the other necessarily will also follow. And so this is why it's important that the dollar if you're the administration and you're the United States, this is why it's important that where dollar demand decreases in one part of the world, it has to increase in another part of the world. And I'm just telling you how it is. The United States is going to dollarize the Western Hemisphere. I think that's pretty clear from here. All right. With that, we do have some questions. All right. I see a lot of comments in the chat here about maybe Maduro took a deal. And I've seen some Democrats and some other foreign pundits say this basically. So President Trump and Maduro did talk on the phone 2, 3, 4 days, I don't know, before this raid happened. And apparently maybe this raid was supposed to happen 4 days prior, but the weather was bad. So they had to wait for a break in the weather. And then when they got the all clear, they went in and got Maduro. So I have seen people say Maduro on this phone call with Trump basically said, Trump said, you can do this the easy way or the hard way, but you're out one way or the other. And Maduro said, okay, that's fine. We'll do it the easy way. And he turned himself in. I'm not saying that he did this. I'm telling you, that's what these people are saying. And that the Delta raid was this elaborate piece of global theater. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. I tend to doubt it. I don't know whether that happened or not. I'm just telling you what people are saying. Why can't this administration arrest leakers in Congress when they have intent on sabotaging a law enforcement / military action to protect our citizens? Well, the problem with leaking is sometimes it is done publicly and openly and deliberately. And in that case, you violate national security laws. And unless you're a member of Congress, you may get arrested. The problem with the great many leaks is it's very difficult to source it back to an actual leaker. So the New York Times reports something, and the Obama administration threatened a number of journalist outlets, and I think the Trump administration did too, basically trying to find leakers. And it's just a very difficult counterintelligence problem. And so I think that's probably one reason why. You've got to have the political appetite to go after them. The DOJ does. And then you also have to have the counterintelligence capabilities to track that leak back to its original source, which can be difficult, sometimes impossible within the rule of law. Oil, it's all about the oil. It's not just about the oil. It's not just about the oil. It's not just about the drugs. It's about removing China's key point of leverage in the Western Hemisphere. What's the likelihood that Maduro coordinated his capture with the U.S.? If not him, what about the Venezuelan generals? Yeah, so I think there probably is an expectation, or it would make sense that there's maybe a handful of generals somewhere counting their money right now that they had delivered on their helipad at their new swanky mansion. So yeah, maybe the whole point of having a $50 million bounty on information that leads to the capture of Maduro, in conjunction with the United States, and we've been talking about this since September, the United States strategy of choking off revenue streams from Maduro, because if Maduro does not have drug money coming in, he can no longer pay his generals and pay his people. And if he can no longer pay his generals and his people, then they have reduced reason to stay on his side. And so I think that's kind of the 1-2 punch there, is saying, well, Maduro can't pay anymore, but we've got pallets of money. We got $50 million to give you. And that's probably another reason why Maduro had Cuban security, not Venezuelan security, because Venezuelan security is probably seen as corruptible, potentially. So I don't know. That's all I got to say about that. All right. What is the probability that an insurgency in Venezuela will start and be supported by Iran? Probably 0% by Iran, Colombia, and China. Lesser degree by Colombia, maybe lesser likelihood by China. Also, do you think that some of the terrorist sleeper cells there in the U.S. will be activated as retaliation for Venezuela? All right. The insurgencies happen for a number of reasons. You got to have grievances. You got to have armed, politicized social bases, and you have to have some claim to legitimacy, or at least contest the legitimacy of whoever's in charge. And if you have those three things, you pretty much have a recipe for an insurgency. And let's look at Venezuela. Do they have grievances on the anti-communist side? Yes, of course. but there probably would not be, or maybe probably would not be an insurgency by the anti-communist side. It would be if the communists are thrown out of power, they resort to insurgency to try to weaken and topple the American-backed government there. So would they be armed, politicized social bases? Yes, they would. And would they have some claim to legitimacy, or at least be able to contest the legitimacy? Well, potentially. I think this is why elections are so important eventually. What it seems like now to me is that we're probably not to the level of having a transitional government. But if you are the United States, you're of course trying to moderate this new president's position and maybe use some carrot and maybe threaten a whole lot of stick. So I think just in the interim, the chances for an insurgency are quite low right now, but we will have to see what happens to leadership at the national level. And I don't know enough about Venezuela to talk about that, but obviously people at the agency and Southcom and some other places, obviously there are some people who do, and you get those people in a room and you get to ask them questions and they give you their take, and the president's going to get an extremely detailed understanding. And at some level, those decisions will probably be, some of those decisions are going to be delegated. President Trump's not going to be sitting here and making every little decision, but the U.S. selection of the next national leader in transition is obviously going to be key. And then if they can run successful elections, then Venezuela has probably a very bright future if they can defeat the communists. But I don't know enough about Venezuela to say exactly how likely that is. If capturing Maduro is not legal, then won't this force Congress to reverse their position regarding presidential powers? Also, we have an extradition agreement with Venezuela. All right, so there has been the case, Robert. Yeah, sorry to bring you on here. There has been the case made by Democrats that this was illegal, that the president violated his powers. You can't just go into a foreign country and arrest a sitting president, legitimate or illegitimate, and extradite him back to the United States because Venezuela is not subject to U.S. laws. Part of this whole realpolitik national security strategy thing is not necessarily making foreign leaders subject to U.S. laws, but certainly if you're a foreign leader that the United States does not like, and you're also in violation of drug laws and you are actively drug trafficking, then it may not matter whether you fall under U.S. jurisdiction or not. We'll kind of move the boundary and make you fall under it. We'll come get you. So at any rate, what's the legal case or illegal case for this?
As far as I understand, there's a Supreme Court precedent that originated from the Kiki Camarena case. So after Kiki Camarena was murdered,
so he was a DEA agent back in the 80s or 90s, yes. And he was undercover, infiltrating and trying to map out networks in Colombia, correct?
Colombia and Mexico, and okay. So he was murdered. And some DEA agents went down to Mexico and kidnapped one of the head guys who had him murdered and brought him to the United States, and he was successfully prosecuted. And there's a Supreme Court precedent from that case that says basically it doesn't matter how someone charged under U.S. law makes it to the United States. That's not actually a legal defense that they were kidnapped. And so I don't think there's really a case here for anyone to argue necessarily. There's a case they could say that it's illegal, but I don't think it actually matters. I think the Democrats are going to focus on the war powers situation because there is a path there for them to disrupt the Trump administration operations in Venezuela there. I don't think they're going to successfully argue that he illegally kidnapped Maduro because in this criminal prosecution, that's not going to matter.
Mm-hmm. You know what this reminds me of, this case? Do you remember it's about 6 months ago, something like that, sometime last year, there's a cartel leader who just miraculously appeared at the El Paso airport, flew from Mexico to El Paso, and just amazingly, there were a handful of DEA agents sitting on the tarmac waiting to arrest this guy. And this was not widely reported. I maybe saw it in U.S. news like a few days or a week or two after it happened, but I read it in Mexican news the day after and talked about it on the show as well. Basically, it looks like DEA worked with a rival cartel in Mexico to kidnap this rival cartel leader and fly him to El Paso where he was arrested. And that is basically, you would call that kidnapping, but apparently DOJ does not care how they get here as long as they get here. That's the bottom line, correct?
Correct. And also U.S. law, as far as the Supreme Court's concerned, doesn't care either.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Next question is, do we have an extradition agreement with Venezuela? It seems difficult to believe that we do, but I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think we do.
Okay. I mean, it seems like if you're Maduro, you would not just be like, oh, yeah, sure, we'll give America whoever you're trying to looking for. All right. Under military and key Supreme Court precedents, when should a captured foreign national with ties to designated terrorists be tried in military commission versus a federal court, especially for a high-profile leader like Maduro? Well, I think that probably depends on how they're indicted. If they're indicted by DOJ, that means DOJ is bringing charges against them. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, that would be the precedent, is basically what they're being charged for. And I think also our status, if the Congress had declared war on Venezuela, then you're talking military tribunal. I think under this is a criminal justice action as far as the Trump administration is concerned.
Mm-hmm. All right, and I'm no legal scholar, but some of the dudes down at Gitmo, they had military trials. Correct. I mean, some of the higher ranking guys, they appeared in New York court.
Well, and that was actually a big controversy during the Bush administration, was that because they are illegal non-combatant or illegal combatants, that they didn't want to bring them to the U.S. to face trial, all of them. And they tried to do military tribunals. That was a big controversy during the Bush administration, was what counts as, where do they go, because they are not declared combatants. So military tribunal isn't necessarily where they should go. But also they didn't want to bring them to the United States to go through civilian courts because of the potential for some of the defenses they would raise, or the Bush administration, I think, was concerned that they would win their trial or be released otherwise.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's stay in this realm, Robert. So Maduro is scheduled to appear, maybe he's there now, appear in a court in New York today to face these charges. What happens if the judge were to dismiss these charges for whatever reason?
I guess technically he would have to be released, but I imagine the Trump administration is not going to allow that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like after hours after the story broke, we saw the memes on the internet. Federal judge orders release of Maduro. All right, how does Trump avoid an insurgency or failed state similar to Libya in Venezuela now? Well, all this comes down to legitimacy. You have to ensure legitimacy and credibility in everything you do. You cannot give the opposition a reason to try to eject you using non-judicial or extra legal means, such as through insurgency. So there's going to be there are a lot of components there. Information operations, or psychological operations, propaganda is obviously going to be a very big one. But we'll see. The other part of this is that Venezuela has to determine the future of Venezuela. This is not a scenario where the Trump administration can just come in and say, yeah, I pick you. You're the president now. You're going to run Venezuela. They would have that would lead to a huge mess, and potentially an insurgency from the pro-communist side. Another thing everyone has to realize, that there's a finance guy that I followed on X for a while, and he was basically saying, he was talking about Colombia and how Colombia was so bad in the 80s because you had these narco terrorists and there's bombings, and also into the 90s. And he said the Colombian army didn't win. They just made peace. And yeah, you have to understand, most insurgencies end in political settlements. You look at the FARC in Colombia, scores and scores of them were killed. I mean, just like a massive kill-death ratio. And several years ago, there was this whole, and U.S. Special Forces 7th Group, maybe 20th Group also, 20th Group definitely, has also been down in Colombia doing this, advising this stuff. The agency, CIA, has been down in Colombia advising and doing all this stuff against the FARC. And what happened was the FARC eventually, they more or less agreed to political concessions. The FARC would stand down, they would turn in their weapons, they would have some form of amnesty and reconciliation, and then a portion of the FARC would get their political representation. So it is possible, looking at Venezuela, that there is some form of deal where when the legitimacy of this the new communist president is challenged, when there are elections, if you're a member of the party there and you realize that your time is up, that you don't have any lines of support, that you have no revenue, you have no legitimacy, eventually all that means you have no authority. Remember, legitimacy, capacity, and authority. That is what keeps governments in power. You reduce the legitimacy, you reduce the capacity, you reduce their authority, and there's a decent chance you will no longer be in power. So if you're the Trump administration and you want to avoid an insurgency, you have to give legitimacy, capacity, and authority to the people that you want to be in charge. And hopefully that is done through the electoral process. So the administration has not released any details. Presumably we will see elections, but I think there has to be, the last thing that you want is to organize elections and have them be failed or stolen or so highly contested that it does devolve into some form of armed conflict, where you have the anti-communist side saying, nope, we're not doing this again. And then you have the communists saying, well, yeah, of course we're going to go to war to keep our power, because if we're forced out of power, we're going to be hanging from lampposts, which is realistically what's going to happen to some of them in the future. So I hope that answers your question. All right, we still got a lot of questions. We're going to have to cover some of these questions tomorrow. We'll do this last question today. Should Venezuela or Cuba experience a collapse in government and basic public services? Are their nations in the region, besides the U.S., in a position to send soldiers and aid to stabilize the situation? And would the U.S. leading such an effort tie up a lot of U.S. military and other resources? Well, yes. So this is a good question. Yes, there are political, like extra national diplomatic alliances in South America. And so, yes, there almost certainly would be a coalition of South American countries that would probably offer peacekeeping or offer some form of assistance in addition to the United States. If you're the United States, you obviously want to replace the Venezuelan government. Well, typically I would say you do this without a major disruption to public services. But let's be honest, public services have already been disrupted in Venezuela for decades. So I think conditions in Venezuela in terms of public services probably could not get much worse. And listen, this becomes a very, very, very easy value proposition for the United States, because through strategic messaging, IO campaigns, PSYOP stuff, you say, look, we're going to invest money, and your neighbors are going to invest money, and we're going to rebuild your national oil infrastructure so that you can start selling oil, so that we can make sure you have clean water and we can keep your power on, and we can build university, or we can build schools and universities for your kids. And we can, you can poop indoors, and we'll come and pick up your trash, and have all these public services that will make Venezuela a first world country within probably a decade or maybe a generation. So if you're just the average Venezuelan and you say, oh, my kid can get an education and get a good job, and he doesn't have to steal stuff. Oh, and by the way, we can get food. I can go down to the store and buy and have a selection of 20 different brands that I want to buy instead of just one. And I can send my kid to school and he can have a better job. He doesn't have to be a fruit vendor on the side of on the road. That's like a pretty appealing kind of thing, because really, I mean, we saw this in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even just the average human being just wants to have some level of comfort and know that their kids are going to do better than they did, or that they want to give their kids a good life. And this is something that their kids do not have under their current system, and they will have under a future system. So I actually think the value here is not going to be that. The message is not going to be that difficult to form here for the average Venezuelan. At any rate, lots to come there. And I don't know, Jared, Robert, have y'all seen anything from the Trump administration about whether we're actually going to put boots on ground in Venezuela? I think that's a mistake. I hope we don't do that. I do hope South American countries do that.
Trump said that he's not afraid of it, but doesn't intend to do it.
Okay. So that kind of sounds to me like it's not real likely.
I do think that, to your point of legitimacy, that's why he's backing the vice president. And it's very important that the military there has said, resume normal operations. It's going fine. And we are backing the vice president. So that largely mitigates the need for boots on the ground and provides a ton of legitimacy to the Venezuelan public.
Yeah, you have to facilitate elections and let the Venezuelans choose their next leader. That's the light at the end of the tunnel here. Robert, anything to add?
Yeah, I think somebody in the Trump administration learned the lesson from Iraq, the de-Baathification campaign that led to Al Qaeda in Iraq like exploding. And I think somebody learned that lesson, and that's why they're focused so much on this is more like a punitive raid rather than an invasion and counterinsurgency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't expect this will turn into an Iraq for sure. All right. Robert, Jared, great points all around. Thank you. And thanks to everyone at home for watching. We appreciate your support. Lots more to follow on Venezuela, obviously on Iran. Come back tomorrow morning. We'll be talking about Iran, I imagine, for like the next several weeks. And it could get pretty exciting over there. All right, with that, everyone, have a great rest of your day. Thanks again for watching. We will be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show, starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.